What if a pilot's most dangerous enemy wasn't in the sky but in their own mind? On a quiet spring morning, a Germanwings flight took off from Spain, its final destination, Germany. On board were 150 passengers and crew, all unaware that a single, deliberate act was about to send their plane on a horrifying and meticulously controlled descent. What investigators would soon uncover was a chilling story of a concealed illness and a fatal paradox. A security measure designed to protect against hijackers that became a weapon against everyone on board. For the 150 passengers of Germanwings Flight 9525, the early moments of the flight were perfectly ordinary. The aircraft, a low-cost subsidiary of the German airline Lufthansa, carried a diverse group of passengers, including 16 students and 2 teachers returning from a school exchange. No one on board had any idea that their final moments would be meticulously controlled by the very person tasked with getting them to their destinations safely. At 10:30 a.m. Central European Time, the flight was cruising at its assigned altitude of 38,000 feet. A minute later, the plane's autopilot was intentionally reprogrammed, sending it into a rapid and unauthorized descent. This wasn't a mechanical malfunction. What investigators would soon uncover was a deliberate act of destruction that would expose a terrifying vulnerability at the heart of the entire aviation industry. Over the next 10 minutes, the aircraft descended at an alarming rate of about 3,400 feet per minute, an unnerving, deliberate trajectory toward the French Alps. French air traffic controllers repeatedly tried to make contact, but their calls went unanswered. The air traffic controller declared a state of distress, and a French military jet was scrambled to intercept. At 10:40 a.m., radar contact with the Airbus A320 was lost. A final, devastating impact was recorded by a seismological station at 10:41 a.m. How do you find a motive for a senseless act of violence, a criminal whose authorized presence is the perfect cover? This is the fundamental nightmare of the insider threat. The French Bureau of Enquiry and Analysis for Civil Aviation Safety, BEA, was called in to lead the investigation. The physical evidence was minimal, a scene of utter destruction, with human remains and aircraft debris strewn across the mountainside. The potential for catastrophe was immense. Investigators turned to the aircraft's most powerful tool, the black boxes, the flight data recorder, and the cockpit voice recorder. They painstakingly began to analyze the data and transcripts, searching for any unusual activity. It was like listening for a single ghost in a sea of static. And then they found it. The cockpit voice recorder captured a harrowing, minute-by-minute account of the final moments. The co-pilot, Andreas Lubitz, was in the cockpit alone. The captain, Patrick Sondenheimer, had left to use the lavatory. The sounds of the captain pleading through the intercom, then knocking, and eventually trying to break down the reinforced door were all recorded. His final, heart-wrenching words captured a struggle that was both physical and emotional. "For God's sake, open the door and open the goddamn door." The truth was chilling. The pilot wasn't a victim of circumstance. He was a perpetrator. The tragedy of Flight 9525 was the result of a deliberate, calculated act by co-pilot Andreas Lubitz. At 27 years old, Lubitz was a first officer with a professional demeanor that hid a long and severe history of mental illness. He had the keys to the kingdom, and he had just used them to try and bring it down. When the investigation focused on Lubitz, they uncovered a history of concealed struggles and premeditated actions that would transform the case entirely. The motive was not about money or revenge. It was far more terrifying. When investigators delved into Lubitz's personal life, they uncovered a history almost too bizarre to believe. This was no sudden break. It was a deeply concealed struggle that had been ongoing for years. His medical certificate, a mandatory requirement for pilots, was first issued in 2008. However, in 2009, a waiver was placed on it due to a prior severe depressive episode. This waiver was conditional, stating it would be invalid if he experienced a relapse. This condition placed the entire burden of reporting a relapse on Lubitz himself, a dangerous conflict of interest that pitted his career against his health. In the months leading up to the crash, Lubitz's mental state deteriorated significantly. He began to exhibit symptoms consistent with a psychotic depressive episode episode in December 2014. Just 2 weeks before the crash, a private physician diagnosed him with a possible psychosis and recommended psychiatric hospitalization, but this information was never shared with his employer, Germanwings, or the aviation authorities. In the period leading up to the tragedy, Lubitz visited 41 doctors, none of whom felt they could inform his employer due to strict privacy laws. Perhaps the most compelling evidence of premeditation was the discovery that Lubitz had rehearsed the event on a previous flight on the same day. Analysis of the flight data recorder revealed that while he was alone in the cockpit for about 4.5 minutes, he fiddled with the plane's descent settings several times, even setting a low altitude of 100 feet. This chilling rehearsal, combined with his history of severe struggle and active concealment from his employer, showed a clear progression toward a predetermined, violent outcome. This raises an intriguing question. What exactly did he do to the plane that made him so certain it was a death trap? Lubitz's weapon of choice wasn't a bomb or a gun. It was a reinforced cockpit door. His method was simple, but his target was sophisticated and exceptionally critical: the 149 people on board. To understand the danger, you have to understand the paradox of this door. The reinforced cockpit door, a direct and global response to the events of 9/11, played a critical and unforeseen role in the crash. The new doors were designed to resist forcible entry, with complex locking systems that included a keypad for authorized crew entry and an override switch inside the cockpit. This system had a fatal, unforeseen loophole. The investigation concluded that after the captain left the cockpit to use the lavatory, Lubitz locked the door and intentionally overrode the door code from the inside. The cockpit door has 3 modes: unlock, norm, and lock. Lubitz engaged the lock mode, which overrides the emergency access function, making it impossible to open the door from the outside for a period of about 10 minutes. This feature, intended to protect against an external threat, was used as a weapon from within. For 10 agonizing minutes, Captain Sondenheimer was locked out of his own cockpit, a helpless witness to the unfolding horror. The cockpit voice recorder captured his increasingly desperate attempts, first using the intercom, then banging on the door, and finally, the sounds of him trying to smash it open with a crowbar. Inside, Lubitz remained silent, his steady breathing audible on the recording until the final impact. He had turned the plane's most important safety feature into an impenetrable tomb. The very system designed to prevent a hijacking was now facilitating a murder-suicide, creating a perfect, chilling paradox. The door that was meant to keep threats out had just locked a catastrophic threat in. But while the technical plot was chilling, the official story left many with a deep sense of unease. The Germanwings crash forced a global confrontation with a profound ethical and legal dilemma: the balance between a patient's right to medical privacy and the public's right to be protected from harm. The tragedy exposed how a legal and cultural framework intended to protect individuals failed to prevent a catastrophe. In Germany, medical confidentiality is a highly protected right. French investigators from the BEA were met with a significant obstacle when German doctors who had treated Lubitz refused to speak with them, citing German privacy laws. This legal barrier frustrated the investigation and highlighted a core systemic conflict. The subsequent philosophical debate acknowledged that while medical confidentiality is crucial for building patient trust in extreme cases of a direct threat to public safety, this right may be in tension with other obligations. The BEA report explicitly cited a lack of clear guidelines on when public safety outweighs confidentiality as a contributing factor to the failure to prevent the crash. This legal framework, combined with a cultural stigma, created a perfect storm. The BEA report pointed to a probable fear of losing his right to fly as a key reason for Lubitz's failure to self-report his declining mental fitness. Pilots face a unique professional dilemma. Seeking help for a mental health issue could jeopardize their career and financial well-being. The public's immediate reaction, which often links mental illness with violence, created a dangerous stigma that could discourage pilots from seeking the care they need for fear of professional repercussions. This leads to a cascade of haunting what-ifs. Lubitz had visited 41 different doctors in the years leading up to the crash, with one even recommending psychiatric hospitalization just 2 weeks before the flight. What if just one of those doctors had felt empowered or legally obligated to breach patient confidentiality and alert the airline or aviation authorities? What if Germanwings had a more robust system for monitoring the psychological fitness of its pilots? Beyond relying on self-disclosure, the entire tragedy hinged on a series of systemic gaps, where privacy laws, professional fears, and a lack of oversight allowed a profoundly ill man to walk into a cockpit with the keys to a flying missile. Perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the Germanwings case is not what Lubitz did, but that he was in a position to do it at all. He was not a ghost who slipped through the cracks. He was a classic known wolf, a pilot whose history was littered with red flags that were either missed or ignored. His employer was never made aware of the full extent of his history of severe depression and his recent diagnosis of possible psychosis. This pointed to a profound systemic failure, a lack of information sharing between doctors, patients, and employers that allowed a high-risk individual to simply continue in a safety-critical role without his troubled history following him. The tragedy was a catalyst for fundamental changes in aviation safety, prompting regulators and airlines to re-evaluate their approaches to security, pilot health, and training. The response progressed from immediate reactive measures to more thoughtful systemic reforms. Immediately following the crash, the European Union Aviation Safety Agency recommended a two-person cockpit rule, which many European and Canadian airlines swiftly adopted. This rule mandated that at least 2 authorized persons, a pilot and a flight attendant, be in the cockpit at all times. However, this measure was largely dropped by 2017. A subsequent analysis by the aviation industry and regulators concluded that the rule was ineffective and could introduce new risks, such as more frequent cockpit door openings, which could potentially compromise security. The most significant and enduring changes came from a re-evaluation of pilot mental health screening. Recognizing that the old system, which relied heavily on pilot self-disclosure, had failed, EASA implemented new regulations in 2018. The new framework requires airlines to conduct a comprehensive psychological assessment of flight crew members before they begin line flying and to provide proactive and non-punitive flight crew support programs. These programs are designed to assist and support pilots in seeking help for any issue that could negatively affect their ability to fly safely without the fear of professional repercussions. The US has followed a similar path, with the FAA liberalizing its approach to pilot mental health, expanding the list of certifiable conditions and approved medications. But the core lesson remains: the most sophisticated fences and security checkpoints are meaningless if the threat is already on the inside. What do you think? Has the aviation industry struck the right balance between a pilot's right to privacy and the safety of passengers? Let us know in the comments and dive into our next video.